mitigation with regards to avifauna and wind energy, particularly as the sector starts to transform quite quickly. So today's session is about strengthening the avifaunal mitigation across South Africa's wind energy sector. And the idea of today is really to unpack what is working, what remains inconsistent, and what evidence is telling us about real mitigation outcomes. I'm going to go straight into the house rules because we're expecting just over 400 people to attend today's session. I'm going to ask if everyone on the call can please ensure that their microphones are muted unless you are invited to speak, and that your cameras are off so that we can try and reduce the bandwidth. When we do go into the panel discussion, the panelists, you can keep your cameras on. If you do have any or are experiencing any technical issues, you're welcome to message the host and we'll try and assist you as best as we can in the chat. Throughout the process, please take note that the session will be recorded and it will be shared post this engagement. And there'll also be additional links that will be provided by the team. If you have questions for the panelists, there is a Q&A button at the top of your screen. Please enter that Q&A and ask some of those questions. And if we have time towards the end of the session, we'll definitely try and engage and ask some of those questions towards the panelists today. I am going to ask, if you can, in putting your questions forward, try and be as respectful in the comments as possible. So colleagues, without further ado, firstly, I'd also like to just say thank you to SAWEA, Birdlife South Africa, and the Birds and Renewable Energy Task Team for making today happen. And to take us into the context of today, I'm going to invite Matt Law. And Matt Law is from Redcap Energy, and he's one of the senior project managers, but he also plays a role and has a hat with SAWEA. So Matt, over to yourself to just give us the context for today's session.
Thanks very much, Kish. As Kish mentioned, I am, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Matthew Law. I'm Senior Project Manager at Redcap Energy. I'm also a registered environmental assessment practitioner with 15 years of experience as an EAP and as an environmental economist. I'm also the chairperson of the Wind Energy Association's Project Development Standing Committee, and this issue is one that is incredibly close to my heart. So my colleagues that are working with me on this initiative have asked me to say a few words to frame why the inconsistent application of avifaunal mitigation is such an important issue facing the wind energy industry in South Africa. Santosh, if you could go on to the next slide, please. I think most of us know that wind energy is really special because it has a small and dispersed footprint. So what that means is that wind turbines and other infrastructure can be sited to avoid the most sensitive environmental features in most cases. And wind energy can also coexist with a number of other productive land uses, including nature-based land uses. So on paper, this makes wind energy an incredibly clean, green, and low-carbon alternative energy source. But there is a bit of a catch. Wind turbines pose a threat to things that fly, and in particular with regards or relative to the conversation today, avifaunal species. Wind is quite different to most other industries. You know, in other industries, your typical or your major ecological impacts take place at the start of construction, where you have site clearing and therefore displacement of animals and loss of habitats and loss of those animals that rely on those habitats, as well as future generations of those habitats in perpetuity. Whereas wind is different. In some ways, wind is a victim of its own ability to coexist with other land uses, including nature-based land uses. And this means that animals continue to use the habitats at and around wind energy facilities and move through the sites. In the case of birds, they fly through the sites, and unfortunately, from time to time, they collide with wind turbines with fatal consequences. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. So because it is well recognized that avifaunal impacts are a particular concern when it comes to wind energy facilities, avifaunal impacts receive focused attention in the EIA process. Even though they get such focused attention, the outcomes or mitigation performance at wind energy facilities varies greatly. as we were able to see in Birdlife South Africa's 2025 summary of fatality monitoring reports at South African wind energy facilities. The reason that this takes place, in my opinion, is that there's inconsistent risk characterization or inconsistent and inadequate risk characterization at wind energy facilities during the environmental impact assessment process. That means the true avifaunal risks aren't exactly known, and therefore planning and financial provision is therefore not put aside for avifaunal mitigation and adaptive management, making adaptive management very, very tricky during operations. And the second reason is that different developers respond differently to the level of avifaunal risk that is experienced on site. This situation persists because often there are vague commitments with regards to operational avifaunal mitigation and environmental management programs, and oversight and enforcement has been limited to date with limited independent audits of operational wind energy facilities. And there's also a third reason I believe that this situation persists, and I think that is to do with apparent contradictions in policy that encourages renewable energy in areas where there are sensitive bird species, coupled with unclear limits of acceptable change for these bird species. And at this point, I think it's very important to keep in mind that avifaunal fatalities, particularly of large and sensitive species, can often be avoided quite effectively. But the trade-off then would be expensive electricity. And I'll touch on that more later. If we could go on to the next slide, please, Santosh. This situation is allowed to persist, as I've mentioned, and it really has a significant impact on the industry. And in my opinion, what I'm about to say now is the really core issue at hand. You see, avifaunal mitigation is extremely expensive, both in terms of the systems that are, or the cost of the systems or shutdown on demand programs, and in terms of potential production losses from shutdowns and curtailment. That means that the avifaunal mitigation affects the financial model of a wind energy facility, or the cost of electricity and the relative competitiveness of a project. That means that if two developers were facing the same level of avifaunal risk, and one of those developers elected to implement substandard avifaunal mitigation, that would create a perverse incentive for the other developer to implement similarly substandard mitigation in order to ensure competitiveness. This drives a race to the bottom, leads to unsustainable impacts, and threatens the reputation of the industry, and therefore is of critical importance to the South African Wind Energy Association. So how do we address this problem? Santosh, if you could go to the next slide, please. Recognizing the importance of this issue to the industry, the South African Wind Energy Association and Birdlife South Africa have collaborated to develop voluntary guidance on the minimum requirements for avifaunal mitigation in South Africa. This guidance is intended to be developed through a process of consultation and engagement, but the current thinking is that the guidelines would encourage industry to set their own measurable avifaunal mitigation outcomes, but be less prescriptive or not prescriptive at all when it comes to mitigation actions. In other words, they will focus on what should be achieved, the mitigation outcome, as opposed to how that outcome should be achieved, the mitigation actions. But as I mentioned, these guidelines are intended to be developed through a process of engagement and consultation with the industry. And the first step in that process is this panel discussion today, but more specifically towards the end of the month, we'll be hosting a series of 3 in-person workshops in Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, and Johannesburg to try and develop these guidelines further in consultation with the industry, and I'll provide more details on that later. You may be wondering why I've got an ostrich on a slide that talks to avifaunal mitigation at wind energy facilities and turbine collisions, but the ostrich and the African penguin are very quickly becoming my 2 favorite bird species in South Africa the more I deal with these issues. Last slide before I hand over to Kish, please, Santosh. Thank you. Just before I do hand over to Santosh, I would like to just explain the concept of avifaunal fatality thresholds to those who may not be familiar with the concept. Avifaunal fatality thresholds are a method of benchmarking avifaunal mitigation performance at wind energy facilities based on the number of avifaunal species that are killed at a wind energy facility over a certain period of time, typically a year. In other words, they are the limit of the number of birds that can be killed at a wind farm in a particular period. Typically, or it is expected that when one is talking about measurable outcomes for operational performance at wind energy facilities with regards to avifaunal mitigation, avifaunal fatality thresholds are discussed. They are complicated and they are controversial, but they are applied in other regions of the world, including the United States and Europe, and they're used by the International Finance Corporation to benchmark avifaunal mitigation performance at the projects that they fund. I believe, therefore, that avifaunal fatality thresholds have a place in the discourse with regards to avifaunal management at wind farms in South Africa, especially as triggers for adaptive management. And I also believe that they present a number of important opportunities to level the playing field for developers in the industry or to make the industry more fair. And with that, and without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Kish to lead us on this important and exciting panel discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Matt. So I think Matt actually raised a really good point in his context setting and presentation. There are a number of people who are on the call, and you are likely on different steps in the journey with regards to wind energy and biodiversity. So if you do have questions around some of the technical terms that might be said over the course of the panel discussion, please post it in the chat and we'll try and address that, because we really want to leave this session where we've tried to de-jargonize the conversation today as best as we can. I think recognition in terms of the panel that we are bringing together developers, operators, scientists, NGOs, and government to really explore how we can move from fragmented mitigation approaches towards more predictable, standardized, and outcomes-based practices. So if I could go to the next slide, please, Santosh. We really, in introducing the panel, I'd like to just highlight that we have some really critical expertise from the sector that have taken the time to join us today. So we've got Andrew Pearson, who's the Senior Manager, Head of Environmental at Mulilo. We've got Kagiso Mthembu, who's the Head of Environmental Performance at EDF Power Solutions. Sindiswa Dlomo, who's the Acting Director of the IEA Strategic Support Coordination and Reporting at the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. Victor Loate, who's the Director of Sector Compliance at the Department of Forestries, Fisheries and the Environment. Samantha Ralston-Paton, who is the Birds and Renewable Energy Manager at Birdlife South Africa. Jon Smallie, who's an avifaunal specialist from Wildskies Ecological Services. And colleagues, Matt Law will also be on the panel as well in this session, who is from Redcap Energy, if you missed that earlier. So I'm going to ask the panelists to switch on their cameras. The purpose of today is we've got quite a number of questions, but we're trying to cover the following themes. So policy and regulatory consistency, aspects around standardization and alignment with biodiversity outcomes, looking at evidence-based decision-making and some of the research needs that we need in South Africa, the implementation challenges and practical realities of mitigation, the self-regulation, adaptive management, and governance models. And then right towards the end, we're going to touch on elements of the mitigation hierarchy, specifically around biodiversity offsets and some of the national conservation goals that provide opportunities in the wind energy sector. So to start off with, Andrew, how consistently do you find environmental authorization conditions and EMPR actions applied in South Africa? And what inconsistencies create the biggest obstacles to project delivery and implementation?
Good afternoon, Kish, and fellow panelists, and to everyone that's dialed in today. Yes, thanks, Kish. Well, I find EA conditions generally are quite consistently applied. One has to look at it, various EAs from wind farms generally look the same. So when it comes to the competent authority putting recommendations, they really rely on what comes out of the EIA process. So there's usually a condition in the EMP that requires the compliance with an improved EMPR, as well as there's also usually a EA condition in there that specifically says that one needs to comply with the specialist recommendations in the EIA or in the final EIA report. So the inconsistencies really come from the EIA process and the different EAPs that are involved. So while there are minimum requirements for content of an EMPR, you find across wind farms that the EMPRs generally look quite different, often depending on the EAP, the template that the EAP uses, and when it comes down to the specific bird mitigations or bird recommendations, a lot has to do with the specialist and the specialist's opinion on what the likely impact of that project may be. And given the same set of activity or the same species on a site, you won't always find across all specialists recommending the same requirements or the same level of mitigation. In terms of application, actual on-site implementation of the mitigation, I think there have been some challenges on earlier projects that are operational. I think moving forward now, what I'm finding is we're getting a lot more scrutiny from IFC, from lenders, and I think most IPPs in this space will ensure that they comply with their legal requirements, which is the EMP. So I don't see an inconsistency in across the board in terms of different IPPs not implementing their EMP. If it's there, you need to implement it.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Andrew. Matt, moving on to you, how do varying mitigation requirements across environmental authorizations and EMPRs impact project competitiveness, permitting timelines, and investor confidence in the wind energy sector?
Thank you, Kish. I think with regards to permitting timelines, Andrew touched on it a bit, that there's this inconsistent effort that goes into the EIA process, and your EMPRs are inconsistent. And I think it stems from the fact that there are inconsistent outcomes or requirements during operations, and therefore less responsible developers recognize that if they aren't going to be held to very strict standards during operations, that no incentive exists to accurately and comprehensively characterize risks, and therefore they can save costs and time during the EIA process, and putting more responsible developers at a disadvantage. Regarding competitiveness between the industry or between competitors in the industry, as I've mentioned earlier, I really do believe that this is the crux of the issue facing the wind energy industry in South Africa. And excuse me for repeating myself, but ultimately what that means, because avifaunal mitigation is so expensive, is that it has a direct impact on the financial model, and therefore the cost of electricity, and therefore the competitiveness of the operator of the project. And that means that if a competitor is going to implement substandard avifaunal mitigation, I'm incentivized to similarly implement substandard mitigation in order to remain competitive, and this leads to a race to the bottom, which is the key issue at hand, in my opinion. When it comes to investor confidence, I think it's a little bit more tricky. I'm not sure if variable avifaunal mitigation requirements have an impact on investor confidence per se. I think that in the future, there's the potential for that. But what I do believe poses a threat to investor confidence is that there are unclear limits of acceptable change, unclear requirements for avifaunal mitigation, coupled with an apparent policy misalignment that encourages wind energy development in sensitive avifaunal areas where there's available grid capacity. And this uncertainty, I think, makes the EIA process even more risky, and that does affect investor confidence in a sense.
Thank you, Matt. Victor, from the department side, is there appetite at the regulator level to require standardized data formats so that fatality data is comparable and auditable consistently across wind energy development, and in some ways making operational enforcement a lot easier. And, how could this be done?
Thank you, Kishan, and good morning to my fellow panelists and colleagues from across the sector. I think for me to answer your question, let me respond by saying yes. I think there's a growing appetite and actually there's a need for that requires standardized data format. I think Andrew has touched on it and Matthew has touched on it a bit. So the lack of this standardization currently means operators can report differently. Some will send PDF, some will send Excel spreadsheet documents, some will send summaries, and there would be this inconsistency basically that makes the national oversight extremely difficult. I think there's practical steps that we can make. We can have an adoption of a national data set representation, for example, a simple CSV or a JavaScript object notation format, which required fields that are very important, like the date, for example, the species, the turbine ID, the carcass locations, the search details. I think that representation should be referenced in the conditions, the EMPR or the EA conditions. There are other ones that are a bit complicated. For example, we can publish the approved estimated estimation scripts. We can go that route where we have a Python package that is based on a model so that operators run it and they run the same code. What I'm talking about is a situation where now everybody has to deposit and give the information to the DFFE or SAMBI, for example, for storage, allowing for anonymity, so to speak, and allowing for research. So I just indicated the practical steps that are very low cost and high impact in terms of that. And why is that approach very important? It reduces the disputes and it improves audit efficiency, and over time it gives us the data that we can get and need to assess cumulative impact nationally. So I think that is the approach, and that is how we could look at this. So I think I'm being simple, but I think those are low cost, high impact steps that we can take. Thanks, Jacob.
No, that's excellent, Victor. And it really sets the scene for the rest of the discussion. Because I think, and I'm going to go to you, Andrew, in terms of standardization and how Victor responded now. What form of standardization would help developers and operators better align avifaunal mitigation compliance with biodiversity outcomes? In your opinion?
Thanks, Kish. Yeah, so I think definitely standard operational monitoring data forms. I think that's been something the industry has been toying with or thinking about for a long time. At some point, I believe Sambi was looking into an industry-wide form of reporting mortality data to be captured in a national database. So yeah, that's on the operational side. When it comes to standardized guidelines, thresholds, report, etc., I think a standardized mortality threshold, kind of an off-take that Matt spoke about, for certain species would help. Perhaps with a standard hierarchy of actions, I think Matt used the term adaptive management triggers. So basically, you could have a certain minimum standard of mitigations, something that's quite easy for developers to implement on all wind farms. For example, blade painting might become a requirement regardless of where your wind farm is. If you've got raptors or in the Karoo, you may have to originally have blade painting right from the outset. And then you have to monitor, and if you trigger certain thresholds, for example, in your first year, if you kill X number of raptors, then you must implement a second level of mitigation, maybe a camera system or a observer-based shutdown on demand. If you then still continue to reach the next threshold, you could then be required to perhaps put money into a compensation fund, into conservation initiatives, and basically, so a guideline as to how this how adaptive management works, and when to implement adaptive management. And so if that framework is standardized, I think you could term it almost an adaptive management framework. I think that would be very useful. And I know that I believe it's the Eastern Cape Environmental Department it's something that they're looking at quite seriously and leading the way on that in developing an adaptive management framework. But I think that's something that needs to be looked at nationally.
Perfect. Thanks, Andrew. And I think, you talked about thresholds as well. Matt, I'm going to come back to you. What is an avifaunal fatality threshold, and how would introducing measurable avifaunal fatality thresholds for projects promote competitiveness and certainty for investors and essentially lead towards ecologically sustainable outcomes?
Thanks very much, Kish. Again, I think, as I mentioned previously with regards to avifaunal...
Wow.
So if anybody could just go
Sorry, if you
mute.
could please mute. Go ahead, Matt.
And sorry to repeat myself again, Kish, but avifaunal fatality thresholds is essentially the limit of number of birds that can be killed of a specific species in a given time period at a wind energy facility in order to benchmark the performance of that wind energy facility with regards to avifaunal mitigation. In other words, the number of sensitive species that can be killed at a wind energy facility during a calendar year. And I really do believe that avifaunal fatality thresholds have the ability to improve certainty for investors, improve competitiveness of the industry, and lead to more sustainable ecological outcomes in the following ways. Firstly, in the EIA process, I think it shifts the focus and the discussion away from the mitigation actions, so shutdown on demand, blade patterning. While those are all important, they really come down to your site and the risk that you're facing. But what is far more important in the EIA process is what the outcome is, what should be achieved, how few birds should be killed of specific species within a calendar year. Informal discussions with stakeholders and other, I suppose, commenting authorities, regulators, and other stakeholders within the industry regarding avifaunal fatality thresholds reveal that many of these stakeholders believe that avifaunal fatality thresholds for a number of species should be near zero or even zero. And this isn't because we're talking about avifaunal fatality thresholds. It's not because we're talking about fatality thresholds that this information is coming out. It is the belief held by these stakeholders. But for the first time, having this discussion, fatality thresholds give these stakeholders the currency to communicate those expectations. And I think that is extremely important information. Not only does it provide certainty with regards to the expectations of regulators and other stakeholders, I think it also opens the table for the very important debate that we aren't having in South Africa that needs to be had. Rather than arguing about footprint impacts in the environmental process, which can typically be addressed through wind energy design and mitigation actions, we can start to talk about what can and should actually be achieved with regards to avifaunal mitigation. In other words, and noting that avifaunal mitigation can be effective, we can start to have the hard conversations about whether affordable electricity or near zero fatality rates coupled with expensive and possibly dirty electricity is a socially optimal outcome of the EIA process. And I think that is really important conversation to be had. And avifaunal fatality thresholds really frame that conversation that we need to have as the industry. But I think once we've determined those avifaunal fatality thresholds, there isn't a better approach to standardize avifaunal risk relative, or avifaunal mitigation relative to the level of risk. So it really does level the playing field and promote competitiveness. Furthermore, if you know the limits that you're going to be held to, okay, it really then shifts the incentive onto the developer to accurately and comprehensively identify or characterize avifaunal risk during the EIA process. And as a developer, if I know that I'm going to be held to very high and specific standards, I really want to get a very good idea of the level of avifaunal risk I'm going to face, mitigation costs and potential production losses, as well as to be able to make financial provision for adaptive management, which is unfortunately lacking in some instances at some wind energy facilities. And I think it follows from there that if you are making these decisions and you know your limits and you're starting to get a better understanding of avifaunal mitigation costs and potential production losses, it really does promote application of the mitigation hierarchy. I'm going to start to ask those questions about avoidance far more consistently if I get a better understanding of what the requirements are and what those costs are going to be. So I think in these ways, fatality thresholds would promote fairness in the industry, improve certainty for developers, and lead to more sustainable outcomes at wind energy facilities. And I also believe that they would promote innovation in the shutdown on demand space, which is already moving at a very fast pace internationally.
Okay, great. Thank you, Matt. Cindy, I'm going to come to you. If South Africa were to move from prescriptive mitigation actions towards measurable, standardized mitigation outcomes, what information would the sector need to have in place to enable policy changes for this shift?
Thank you, Kish. It's actually funny because I think Matt has sort of taken or answered the question, because one thing I think even coming out of Windaba that when we had our panel discussion was the importance of risk characterization and the defining of significance, because we need to quantify the risk and describe or the significance of impact and then assess it. And then once we have those things in place, then secondly, we then need to make the link between management actions and the thresholds. Because I think the problem that we're grappling with at the moment is that there is no defined threshold in terms of mortalities for birds. So once we have those things in place and there's an accepted definition from an industry point of view, then we can carry over that into the decisions that we're making, as well as maybe trying to get the required legislation reforms in place to then bring these things into play once we know that us as government officials and as EAPs and specialists out there have the same understanding in terms of what risk characterization is, what significance is, and what are the acceptable levels of impact in terms of fatality thresholds. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Cindy. Victor, back to you. Enforcement is often difficult when outcomes are not measurable. How could regulation evolve to require clear, quantifiable results?
Thanks, Kish. I think in the compliance and enforcement space, for example, we often say that what we cannot measure cannot be managed, and what cannot be managed cannot be enforced, and that is not only the challenge for our country. It's a global issue. So within with that context, let me respond by saying that from our regulatory standpoint, I think one of the biggest challenges, I think, for enforcement in this sector is that many authorizations, many EMPRs and conditions are written in terms of commitments. And I think Matt in the presentation in the beginning touched on it. You would find something that talks to monitor birds and bird fatalities rather than outcomes that can be objectively verified. If you look at the studies around this sector, they show that post-construction fatalities estimates are only comparable when monitoring protocols are standardized. So that means that we use defined such as intervals, we use the same approach and specific statistical estimation. So without these, enforcement becomes subjective. So how we regulate, or the regulation should therefore evolve from input-based conditions. All right. So we must evolve to an outcome-based condition, so to speak. And that means we define what success is, what non-compliance look like in measurable terms. And it can be done, practically. For example, when we mandate a national standard for post-construction fatality monitoring, we can say every operator should follow one protocol for such method, for estimation models, and so forth. And that will allow for comparability across the sites. All right. And one of the things that we can include is this measurable threshold in the environmental management plans. We can set a trigger in terms of the species of concern and set a threshold. And when that threshold is exceeded, then we can look at corrective measures, as Matt indicated, shut down on demand, and we must now force people to implement measures within a set time frame. So with these kind of changes, enforcement become possible because the outcomes, fatalities, threshold, and responses are measurable. We can also audit them, and they are comparable. I think that's the approach that we can take to make it easier for compliance and enforcement. Thanks, Kish.
Thanks, Victor. I think that really sets us in context of the next few questions, where we can talk about evidence-based decision making. And Jon, I'm going to come to you now, Jon. And you've been one of the specialists that you've been active in this sector literally from the start of wind energy in South Africa. From an operational monitoring standpoint, which mitigation measures, in your opinion, have demonstrated clear success in South Africa so far, and which are proving ineffective?
Thanks, Kish, and hi, everyone. Thanks for having me on the panel. I'm going to speak to the bigger mitigation measures, if that's okay. I don't want to get too bogged down in smaller measures. But what I would call the major mitigation measures available to us at the moment for birds are predictive shutdown, responsive shutdown on demand, and blade patterning. On the predictive shutdown, for those of you that aren't familiar with the terminology, that would be where we have a good reason to be able to predict when a bird would be at risk, and we shut down turbines in prediction of that risk materializing. So an extreme example might be shutting down turbines during the day for vultures flying. I'm not aware of any proven effectiveness of that in the country at the moment, although that type of thing is discussed quite often. But I don't see why it wouldn't be effective for the bird side of the equation, because it's a fairly crude instrument. The problem is whether it can be acceptable to the business. So I'm not sure how sustainable it is to keep shutting turbines down in case a bird arrives there. I just don't think that's going to be palatable to the industry. The second mitigation measure is responsive shutdown. So that's where we only shut down in response to a bird actually arriving on the facility. And there are two types of that. Observer-led is where humans spot those birds and instruct the turbines to shut down. And then the second is automated, where cameras or some other technology spot the incoming bird. On observer-led shutdown on demand, I think we've shown that can be pretty effective in South Africa if it's done right. So it's very important that the program is well resourced, well planned, well designed. A lot of preparation is required up front, but it can be a really effective mitigation measure. And we have a couple of operational wind farms that have shown it. Where it isn't effective is where the preparation is poor, it's under-resourced. It becomes a checkbox exercise. And then we are seeing that some species are more challenging than others. So there are a couple of species that are particularly tough to run observer-led shutdown for, mostly the slightly smaller birds. Then in terms of automated shutdown on demand, we don't have a lot of experience as yet in the country. I think there are a couple of wind farms that have implemented quite recently. And I'd really encourage those developers to get any early results out as soon as they can, because it's really critical. But this measure has proven itself elsewhere in the world. There are wind farms around the world implementing hundreds of shutdowns a day effectively and with no fatalities. So the technology approach, I think, has proven itself, and we could embrace it a little bit quicker in the country. And then the last sort of major mitigation measure I'll touch on is blade patterning, which has shown some early promise in South Africa. Rob Simmons has done the work on that. We're all aware of that. Elsewhere in the world, the results are a little bit mixed. There are some projects that have shown it to not be effective. So for me, at the moment, as a mitigation measure, it sits in the territory of being easy and cheap to do if it's done pre-construction or during construction, and I don't really see any downside to it. If you do it and then the risk doesn't materialize, I'm not sure that you've really lost anything. So looping back to a point that Andrew made, I would probably suggest that could become an almost default mitigation measure across wind farms. But I must admit, I don't see it on the same level as shutdown. So I certainly wouldn't be positioning it as either or. I don't think at this stage we have the confidence in blade patterning to say you can blade pattern instead of shutdown. So if you have a risk great enough to trigger one of those major mitigation measures, I think then it should probably be shutdown at the moment, or shutdown and blade patterning. But I probably wouldn't go for only blade patterning on its own. I know Rob's probably on the call and he's probably going to have a go at me for that. And then I just wanted to say that in terms of effectiveness, I think aside from the actual measures, in my experience in the mitigation process, a big challenge has been getting it implemented once a project is operational, the decision-making process. So right from finding dead birds to trying to analyze if that's significant, analyze what the pattern is, and then most importantly, to essentially put pressure on the operator to implement mitigation. That's a space that, maybe speaking for myself and not all specialists, but I find that a really ineffective space to be in, where it's me on my own putting pressure on an operator to do the right thing. And there's no framework, there's no authority assisting, there's no legal requirement for them to implement. So I think a big part of the discussion today needs to, as Matt has said, move us away from that space. It shouldn't come down to that decision-making space. Thanks.
Thanks very much, John. Sam, I'm going to come to you. And with the advancement of mitigation technology in the sector, and you've been involved as well right from the start, what is the process you think we should follow within South Africa to ensure that new potential mitigation measures are adequately tested and in some sense peer-reviewed before being recommended for mass implementation and enforcement?
Thanks, Kish, and hello to everybody online. Yeah, things are moving really, really fast with technology, and it's quite exciting and very encouraging. But the science needs to keep up, and I don't think it really is. There are, unfortunately, very few peer-reviewed papers demonstrating the effectiveness of all the different technology options that we have on the market. So we need to be prioritizing research in South Africa, both on the wind farms themselves, but also off-site. And I could probably extend that to not just technology, but all other mitigation options. I think it was John alluded to, there's a massive amount of monitoring data that gets collected at individual wind farms. But that data often stays in monitoring reports that are kept by the wind farms, not made available. And those studies are never published. There's no incentive for the specialists to go off and get those studies published in peer-reviewed papers. So I think that's the first thing we can do is incentivize more research in South Africa. But yeah, also need to acknowledge that there are some ethical challenges with testing technologies, particularly where we want to test them at high-risk sites, which is normally where developers or operators want to implement them. So we need to think about creative ways on how we measure that success, and acknowledge that maybe the science isn't always going to keep up, and there might be another way around it. That could be to develop clearly defined performance standards for technologies that propose for use. So in other words, asking the question, can that technology detect those target species and initiate a response in enough time to make sure that it isn't at risk of collisions? So those can all happen off-site, but going back to the wind farm, there are often a lot of site-specific criteria that we need to take into consideration. So we need to be able to define how many turbines need to be covered by that technology, and whether that needs to be full coverage or not to reach our desired outcome. So that's where I probably differ a little bit to some of my colleagues on the line who are really motivating strongly for a focus on impact management outcomes. I think it is absolutely important. We've got to do it, but we also need to be able to interrogate whether the actions we currently have available can actually demonstrate or can at least reach that desired outcome in a way that is effective and is feasible. That doesn't need to be cast in stone. Those actions can always change. Environmental management programs, particularly the actions, should be updated and reviewed regularly. So yeah, that's what I think for now.
No, that's excellent, Sam. That also really sets the scene for the next part of the discussion. Just I'm cognizant of time, and it's the first session in a series of sessions on this topic that we're going to have. So I'm going to bounce around a little bit with my panelists. But Jon, I'm going to come back to you because I think Sam's raised a very important point. What are the most urgent data or research gaps that prevent this evidence-based decision making, and what do we need to actually look at in South Africa? Where are the critical areas that perhaps we need to do some more homework?
So I heard what Matthew said about us being poor at characterizing risk at sites, and I think there's merit to that. But I actually think we've become fairly good at collecting data on what is on site and which species are at risk. The problem for me comes in with the next part, which is so what? So we have Vero's eagle on site, we have them this often and this high and all the rest, and we calculate how many we may kill per year. Maybe we'll kill one per year. So what does that mean for Vero's eagle? The EIA should be assessing that as well. So that's the ultimate effect of that project. The impact is one dead Vero's eagle, but the effect is what it does to that population locally and nationally and for the whole species. And I think that's the biggest gap for us at the moment. We get to that point in the EIA where at the moment it's a judgment call because we don't have those thresholds in place, and we don't know how the species can accommodate that effect. So for me, the biggest thing is to get more data on population sizes, more population viability analysis for our priority birds, and get that stuff in place on a national level or a species level, because it can't fall to every EIA to do that. Then we've got 15 or 20 different specialists running it for the same species in different parts of the country. It needs to be a national exercise that will also take care of the cumulative side of the impact. So we need a PVA done for Vero's eagle, which then every EIA from now on can refer to. And that PVA needs to tell us how many fatalities can that species accept, if it can at all. So I think that's the biggest gap for me. And I think that with the arrival of renewables, we've got into a situation where we as a country, we expect the EIA to do everything for us now. And I actually think it's too much now. We need to, there's some national organizations that need to be running some of these exercises proactively and not saying to every EIA, you need to now run a PVA because there isn't one. I think we need to draw the line there somewhere and say, well, these are species of national importance and those PVAs need to be put in place. It's obviously easier said than done, but that's my take on it.
Excellent. Thank you, Jon. I'm going to move into, I think, the challenges and practical realities of implementation. And we've heard a lot about some of the opportunities and the risk in terms of what we're trying to apply. But Kagiso, I'm going to come to you. I mean, I'm going to ask this as straightforward as I can be, but what are the financial challenges related to avifauna mitigation from a industry role player, developer, and operator perspective?
Thanks, Kish, and hello to everyone online. So, Kish, I think we can agree that that question is quite controversial, but I'll try answer it. And I think what is important is if we can understand that I'm going to answer this from a responsible developers or IPP's point of view, because I believe in the industry, there are IPPs or developers that are willing to invest in these avifauna mitigation measures. But I think it's also important to understand that biodiversity is quite dynamic, and the cost of avifauna mitigation can be high, but these systems are worth the investment. So just looking at perhaps one side, which will be the upfront cost, right, of these tools, as Jon has said, that at the moment, we don't have a solution that is 100% effective. So we've got blade patterning that is being still tried out. We've got SDOD that's also still fairly new in South Africa. So developers are willing to invest in this, but I think we need to understand that it's quite difficult investing in a tool that is still, in its early stages. But I guess because that's what we have, we are willing to invest in them. But I think the budgeting during planning stage is possible. I think most responsible developers actually forecast or plan for the avifauna mitigations for operations during the early stages, so either pre-construction or even in construction. But inaccurate cost or costing of these systems creates major challenges for a lot of developers. So, for example, there is a project where, because the SDOD guidelines or the blade patterning guidelines had not been issued by the time this project was being developed, there was a budget set for 1.5 million, which at the time, it probably made sense from the specialist point of view, from the developer's point of view as well. But fast forward to construction, probably 5-6 years later, SDOD costs or blade patterning costs were quite high. So that project probably looked at SDOD cost that amounted to like 5 million rand. And then blade patterning, I've heard Jon saying it could be cheaper. It could be cheaper, yes, but if you paint your blades at the port or at the factory, depending on your turbine supplier, they could still range between 5 million to 7 million, so the costs are quite high, and the plan is to try budget for them quite early on. But I think it's important that the industry, or let me say developers rather, they also relying on industry stakeholders, not only specialists, I think Birdlife, EWT and so forth, so that they can collaborate with the developers, because the developers are the ones that are actually spending costs and spending, investment in these tools. So that's one aspect. I think another aspect that we can look at is the operational cost. Like I've said, that biodiversity is quite dynamic. So we've seen projects where they found bid window 1, bid window 2 or 3, and for the last 8 years they had certain issues, whether birds or bats, but they had just a constant issue. Suddenly, there is species that were not identified within that landscape. So even though there are adaptive management programs that are tied to cost that are within the project financial models, now with the new species based on the new guidelines, now developers have to look at, for example, let's say it's a Marshall Eagle or Varix Eagle. So now let's look at blade patterning. It's harder because we're in operations. It's not as easy to just paint our blades, but we need to be compliant. Okay, let's look at SDOD. So now it's going to the lenders and saying, we need an additional minimum 5 million. So I think for me, the biggest takeaway is that there are big financial challenges. However, we need to still understand that biodiversity is dynamic, and these mitigation tools evolve. As Sam has also said, there's quite a lot in terms of technologies. So much is happening, so much is exciting. Everyone wants to try everything. But as industry, I think we need to really come together, and perhaps the starting point will just be collaboration, but also just data sharing. Let's understand what worked at another wind farm that another wind farm can use. Obviously, the industry is quite competitive, so that's not easy. Trust me, I know. But that's just one of the solutions that I'm just proposing that we can obviously discuss.
Fantastic. So very important point, and I think the reality is, there's practical implementation and consideration that we all need to take into account. And I'm going to come back to you, Sam. I think based on BirdLife South Africa's revision of some of the IPP monitoring reports, are IPPs self-regulating effectively around avifaunal mitigation, or is performance still inconsistent across developers?
I think we've already heard the answer to that, Kish. Unfortunately, it is very inconsistent. And to be fair, I think that there's sometimes very good reasons for it. I think for a start, wind farms aren't all measured against the same standard of success or failure. Commitments to address significant impacts are often quite vague and open-ended. Wind farms are committed to this open-ended thing called adaptive management, but there's no costing to it. It hasn't been properly planned for. And then sometimes, quite honestly, I think we're just all learning, and it's just down to inexperience. And I'm hoping that we, by working together, are going to move forward. And I think one of the first solutions I can come up with is a mandatory contingency budget for unexpected mitigation requirements. The question is, how much will be enough, which I think we're going to have to put our heads together and come up with a figure for that.
Thanks, Sam. I'm going to follow that up with a question around, do you believe voluntary self-regulation can drive measurable change, or is a hybrid model of self-regulation plus an annual independent audit more realistic?
Kish, I think a multi-pronged approach is really needed. I think mandatory environmental authorization throughout the operational phase and through to deconstruction of a wind farm is one approach. Just a caution that those audits do need to be effective audits, not just checking the box and saying, yep, they've done monitoring, but really interrogating what monitoring found and measuring against that defined objective that we've been talking about. I think we need to acknowledge that there's probably always going to be limited capacity within government for oversight and enforcement. And I think it was Matt that referred, or Andrew that referred to the role that banks can play. I think the IFC was mentioned, and banks can and should and sometimes do play a really important role. Unfortunately, it's often behind the scenes, and it would be really nice if we came together and talked to each other a bit more about how we can do it more effectively. And then lastly, I know this makes the industry or some members of the industry quite uncomfortable, but I do think that there's a role for public disclosure. It would be really useful if monitoring reports were shared on wind energy facilities websites, and that way the public can and other stakeholders can hold the errant wind farms to account, but it's also a way to shine light on the good practices and show what it's possible to achieve with the right level of investment and commitment.
Okay, excellent, Sam. So Sam, you raised an important point, and I'm going to come back to you, Victor. As a sector, do we need to strengthen oversight capacity during operation to support outcomes-based environmental management? And I'm sort of specifically referring to the independent audit or the annual independent audit, and how Sam also talked about, having an effective independent audit. Is that going to be helpful to the sector and ensure support towards enforcement?
Absolutely, Kish. I think we strengthening this oversight capacity is very important. And I think we need to move from compliance on paper basically to compliance in practice. That's what we need to do. And I think in many countries, for example, they built a dedicated compliance unit that specializes in data verification. Rather than solely relying on the traditional environmental inspectors that goes out into the field. So I think in our country's context, the outcome-based approach that we are talking about, the management of it will work if, for example, we as regulators can understand the data. We are able to replicate that data in terms of statistical model and maybe act when exceedances occur. So that means both technical capacity and institutional will, so to speak. So there are ways that we can do this. If for example, we establish an annual independent audit for operational wind farms, especially those that we consider as high risk sites. So how is that going to help? The audits should verify the raw data, the estimation method, and the mitigation follow through. So what we need to do, for example, as regulators, is maybe build a small unit, a technical review unit within our departments to focus on wildlife analysis, for example, with a couple of specialists who can analyze the submitted data and validated model and guide enforcement action. So basically, in short, I think we should be strengthening the oversight, and strengthening the oversight is not about increasing the paperwork. It's about building trust in the data that we receive. And once we have that credible, standardized evidence, then we can have enforcement decisions that becomes defensible and transparent and efficient, so to speak. I think that's how we would approach it. Thanks.
Thank you, Victor. Matt, are there lessons that we can take from international markets where avifaunal mitigation has become standardized and in some ways performance-based?
I think performance-based in particular, Kishan, and when you say performance-based in avifaunal mitigation, I immediately think about fatality thresholds. And I think from the international examples, the biggest lesson is that, it is implemented in other regions like USA and Europe, and by the IFC at the projects they funded, and even with imperfect data on a case-by-case basis. And before I continue answering the question, I hope you don't mind that I'm going to digress a little bit and just talk to something that Jon spoke about a few moments ago, talking about population studies in order to be able to determine avifaunal fatality thresholds. And of course, that would be ideal to do this national exercise to be able to inform fatality thresholds. But I'm worried that we never get there because there isn't a national exercise. And I think that there is an opportunity, even with imperfect data, like for the IFC, and Jon know better than I do, to set these fatality thresholds on a case-by-case basis, based on imperfect data and various different precautionary approaches. Okay, and in this way, I think that would incentivize the industry to fund bigger national population estimate studies, so that we can move away from a very precautionary approach and understand sustainable levels of avifaunal fatalities. So I just think that is a potential opportunity there. But as I mentioned, I think that the lesson is from international markets is that avifaunal fatality limits are precedented. It's not a new concept. With strict oversight, and we've touched on that a number of times today, they can be extremely effective in reducing avifaunal fatalities. And I think that they promote certainty for investors and fairness with the industry. And then I believe that the overall lesson is that we shouldn't be scared of them as an industry in South Africa. I mean, I know it is quite high level, but already for bats, based on the size of your wind energy facility and the threat status of bats, we already have a rudimentary system of fatality thresholds that are triggers for additional and adaptive management. So they aren't even unprecedented in South Africa. And I really do believe that they have the potential to lead to more efficient and more sustainable outcomes. There is one caveat I would just like to mention, is that I believe that although precautionary in the face of imperfect information, avifaunal fatality thresholds must be realistic and they must be achievable. And I think that they need to take account of the socioeconomic imperatives facing the country at this point in time. We are an electricity constrained country. We are a country that is desperately needs economic development and jobs, and those have to be factored into the overall decisions about socioeconomic optimality when we're looking for outcomes in an EIA process. But nevertheless, I believe that there can be excellent tools as triggers for adaptive management, allowing for opportunity for continuous improvement, but they shouldn't disincentivize self-regulation and reporting.
Thank you, Matt. You mentioned adaptive management. Cindy, I'm going to come back to you. How can we ensure adaptive management, not rigid compliance, remains central to standardization? Oh, you're on mute, Cindy, sorry.
Thank you. I think one of the main problems that I've picked up is that the current legislation does not necessarily allow for adaptive management. If you look at the EIA regulations currently, in especially with regulation 36 and 37, 36 is focused on actions and not necessarily outcomes. And then once you drill down to outcomes, you have a whole process that you need to undertake for you to change the EMPR. So I think we need to align legislative requirements to adaptive management, because until we do that, then even if we do go on site, we do monitor compliance and we pick up things that need fixing. If you need to go through a 60-day or a 90-day process for you to fix something, it means additional things are going wrong during that period. So we need to maybe start thinking about, when we're developing these standards for trying to standardize the sector, even flexible SOPs that will guide how adaptive management should happen. And those SOPs bypass any procedural requirements if possible. If such SOPs are then entrenched into your decisions in terms of your EIAs and EMPRs, and then they are used as a guide in terms of, if we've been monitoring, as Victor was saying, if you have people that are looking at the data that is coming back from your monitoring and analyzing that data and making decisions in terms of adaptive management as a result of that data, how do we then loop back into the system and make the required changes without necessarily requiring developers to now go through PPP and additional specialist studies, etc., because that's wasted time that is taken away from the actions that need to be implemented immediately to stop the negative impacts that are a result of the outcome. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Cindy. I think that, you know, what we're starting to get is consistency in terms of where the gaps are and where the opportunities lie, which is quite nice. And I want to go back to getting more perspectives from our colleagues from the IPP side, who, you know, have to drive and represent the developers and the operators. So Andrew, I'm going to come back to you. You know, from your experience, what do you think the challenges are that we face, or you face, in determining appropriate avifaunal mitigation during that planning phase that would de-risk the project into operation? And do you adhere to the basic compliance requirements, or is there flexibility to plan for best practice mitigation measures with regards to implementation over and above compliance requirements?
Thanks, Kish. Yes, I think, you know, we're often at the I don't want to say the mercy, but at the guidance of our specialists. And I think for me, one of the challenges is really the different levels of mitigation trust or buy-in or uptake amongst different specialists. Some are very positive about the different available mitigations, where some are really have little faith in it. So that then comes through in different requirements filtering through into our EMP. Regarding your question around whether we stick with the minimum compliance requirements, or whether we have flexibility to implement best practice, we want our specialists, our minimum compliance requirements, we want that to be best practice. And in most cases, that is the specialists are implementing or recommending the best practice. Where that changes is when you have a project authorized and then there's a delay to getting to financial close or delay in getting to construction. So you've got a 3 or 4 year period, and then those recommended mitigations then become outdated. We would then look to still trying to implement best practice, and usually that does it does become a requirement in any case, because quite often we would go through an amendment process to amend our EA. If a number of years have passed, we would update our layout, and that would be an opportunity then for the specialist to recommend updated mitigations. And yeah, I think another thing I want to touch on is the role of lenders. I feel like we're in construction now of some renewable projects, solar and wind, and we're getting a lot of audits from our lenders. The lenders' technical advisors are doing audits during the construction process, and I'm not sure how much the lenders actually look at once it's in operation at these type of avifaunal impacts. So if there can be pressure from lenders doing audits on our impacts, that would incentivize the operational developers to you can't be killing birds and your lenders will not be happy with that. So yeah, hope I got your question.
No, that's perfect. Thank you, Andrew. Okay, so I'm going to get your perspective now, particularly on the operation side of things. I think we've been talking so much about setting systems up, but how do we actually measure where mitigation measures are successful, and what does it take from your perspective?
So I think to measure success, it's based through evidence and data. It's all good and well in the planning phase, but during operations, let's look at specific turbines and how much impact each turbines have. So what we do is obviously during pre-construction, we already have a base data to understand what we could be working with. And then during operations, we then set targets for specific turbines. So we monitor hotspot targets and we test these against the mitigation measures that we've proposed. And I like what Andrew is saying, that there is a lot more interest from the lenders as well during construction, but during operations it's not so much. But I mean, we do submit reports to Birdlife, the Bat Association, and EWT, which also I think that's where some form of accountability comes in. But I do agree with Andrew that there is a lack. And then I think another common tool that we use, which most people are familiar with, is your carcass monitoring trends. I think that's also just a different topic on its own, but we aim to reduce our collision rates, especially for priority species. And then we focus on our shutdowns, or curtailment, assess how effective were they, timely, did we actually minimize any unnecessary energy loss. And it then goes back to whatever we get, we focus on adaptive management cycles. So continuously, let's review, let's refine, and let's remeasure. so that we're able to respond to the changing conditions, And I think it goes back to the earlier point that I was trying to make, to say that this is where we are now seeing that some mitigation measures are proposed from maybe perhaps not just DFFE, but from provincial level, where we're seeing conditions where all avifaunal mitigation tools are proposed for certain projects. And I think we need to look at what is specific for that particular site. So to measure success, it should be on that particular site based on those turbines. You can have a turbine with 10, you can have a site with 10 turbines, only to find that only 2 are the most problematic. But if we are now told that we need to do blade painting, observer-led SDOD, automated SDOD, and radar systems and camera systems early on, I think it can become an overkill, especially if the site is not too sensitive. But I think to close, I'd just say that the goal is to have measurable and sustained reduction in collision risk, which are supported by transparent and data that is verified. Thanks.
Thanks, Kagiso. Thank you. I'm going to go slightly off script here, Victor. I wanted to ask you a question with regards to, as a sector, do we need to strengthen oversight capacity during operation? And it's largely about, trying to get consistency during operation and, what could we actually do to do that?
Thanks, guys. I think one of the biggest governance challenges I think we face is inconsistency, and I think everybody has made that point during the discussions. And Kagiso has just said that facilities are monitored differently. So data is reported in different formats, and the enforcement action vary because of the evidence base is uneven. So strengthening oversight, therefore, is not about adding more bureaucracy. It's about creating predictability and fairness, and also looking at scientific credibility across the entire wind sector. So internationally, for example, you would see that there's independent audits, there's technical verification that improves the quality of data and reduces this reporting bias. For example, from our sector, if data collectors and analysts follow one protocol, for example, and meet minimum competency requirements, the regulators can rely on that data with greater confidence. And operators will benefit from greater clarity and resources that will reduce dispute in a way. So ultimately, for me, strengthening oversight is fundamental to outcome-based environmental management, so that it ensures that the regulations is evidence-driven, the compliance expectations are clear and fair, and the enforcement decisions are consistent, regardless of who inspects or which project is under review. So once governance consistency is achieved, I think we move from reactive case and look at case by case decision and making, and also looking at predictable regulatory systems grounded in transparent, standardized science that will treat everybody the same, and the expectations are there in terms of, if I'm going into this sector, this is what is required of me. So I think that will work out fine. So I know I'm a bit controversial when I'm saying we need to get accredited monitoring practitioners, but there is a need for us to have a greater confidence in terms of the data that we have, so that we change how we do things in terms of monitoring and enforcement. Thanks.
Thanks, Victor. I think those are incredibly valuable points, and it's going to help set the tone for how we start to take these discussions forward through some of the workshops that will be driven across the country. The mitigation hierarchy and the application of the mitigation hierarchy, specifically in the wind energy sector, has been a bone of a contention now since the start of wind energy development. And one of those controversial parts of the process has always been around biodiversity offsets and the potential risks associated with biodiversity offsets, but also since the Global Biodiversity Framework and Target 3, what are the opportunities around utilizing biodiversity offsets from the wind energy sector to drive South African conservation goals? I'm going to start off with you, Kagiso. From your point of view on biodiversity offsets in the wind energy sector, can it contribute to the conservation goals in South Africa?
I believe they can. I think my first straight answer is yes, but because they are critical, they're quite a critical tool in the mitigation hierarchy. But I think it should be emphasized that they should be the last resort. They shouldn't just be used to replace the social impact. So they are necessary, especially in the wind industry, because even though the wind energy projects are renewable, they still have biodiversity impact, as I'm sure we all know. But they can also contribute to the South African National Biodiversity Strategy and, the action plan, and maybe align to the global targets if implemented correctly. I think in the country, there is a potential for landscape level conservation rather than just moving, specific site-specific mitigation when it comes to offsets. But I do wonder, and I'm sure this needs more research, especially maybe from the specialist, but I do wonder that within the renewable energy industry, can we offset some of the impact, especially those for slow breeding species like your cave vultures or your blue cranes, can offsets really, achieve the targets? But also, I think offsets require us to look at the project life cycle. So if it's the 20-year or 30-year timeline, that needs to also be considered. And I think the success depends on the long-term funding mechanism. So your biodiversity stewardship, your conservation easement, and obviously partnerships with different conservation agencies. So in conclusion, I would say definitely yes. I think offsets can contribute to the South African conservation goals, but only if they are scientifically defendable and there is proper or well thought out long-term planning, and they're probably designed to complement and not necessarily replace ongoing site mitigation.
Okay, that's great.
Thanks.
And thank you, Kagiso. That leads us quite nicely into the next question that I'm going to ask, which is a complex question, and I'm going to ask it to someone who I know will be able to unpack it for us. Jon, when it comes to compensation measures like offsets for predicted avifaunal fatalities, and also speaking to what Kagiso said in terms of when you actually do have impact, how can you compensate for that impact? What is the gap that you think we still need to address in South Africa to get this right?
You've got more confidence in me than I have on a Friday afternoon in my abilities, but thanks. Just to speak to your points about mitigation hierarchy, I think it starts there. I think there are two challenges we have there. Firstly, we're not all on the same page about what avoidance means. We haven't defined that. We use the word a lot and we say you must avoid, but we don't define how much. So some of us on the call think it must be 100% avoidance, and some have a different view that it could be less avoidance. So that's where we get stuck in the beginning. And then on the second or third step in the hierarchy on mitigation, as I think Andrew said just now, we're not all on the same page in terms of confidence we have in the mitigation. So that's where the challenge with offsets or compensation starts, is that we can't actually get past the preceding step on the hierarchy. Collectively, we're not all in agreement on that. And again, there's no guidance. So there is no guidance on what avoidance means, how much risk you should avoid. So what I really like about this whole topic today is that it gets straight to the end point of what the outcome is. So you can almost work backwards from there and say, if that's the outcome I'm aiming at, how much mitigation effectiveness do I need and how much avoidance do I need? And you can sort of work backwards up the hierarchy in your thinking. So I think I think the challenge to implementing compensation is that it's still a bit of a dirty word for many of us, and the reaction when you mention it is not great. And it's because people are skeptical and they're not convinced that we haven't jumped to that step too quickly. So I think the more discussions we can have and the more we can define those terms, the more we can get a bit of a common agreement on how to go forward. And the interesting thing is that the organizations in the country with the skills to implement species fatality offsets are sometimes the ones who have the most difficulty getting their mind around an offset or accepting an offset. So we need to try and sort of meet each other somewhere in the middle, because there are a lot of opportunities there. But those organizations hold themselves to very high ethical standards, and they don't want to feel like they're getting bought out or getting paid for a particular outcome. So we have to get everyone around the table comfortable with an offset concept and with the way we got to that point on a project. And then on a national level, we need to have offset-ready organizations. So I've done a couple of these during EIAs, and one of the biggest challenges has been that no one's ready for this in the country. When you call Eskom and say we want to come and put a whole lot of flappers on your power line over there, they, with respect to Eskom, they're blown away. They don't know how to house that or how to ring fence that project or how to package it at all. So some of those institutions that we know the offsets will end up with need to be part of this discussion as much as possible. Thanks.
Thank you, Jon. Yeah, that's food for thought. I think this is going to be, an ever advancing area for us. But I think you've given clarity as to how we can start to bring more direction. I think it is absolutely clear. Cindy, in application of this mitigation hierarchy, and when it is seen as a last resort, what, in your view, regarding biodiversity offsets could contribute towards the National Global Biodiversity Framework Target 3 goals?
Thanks, Kish. Maybe from a competent authority perspective, I should have a disclaimer, because I have yet to see a successful offset. So then when you then pose this question to me, it's a very tricky question to actually try and answer, especially in relation to renewable energy projects, more specifically wind, because as Kagiso said, what exactly are you offsetting? If the discussion that we're having today is centered around bird fatalities and us trying to come up with measures to try and curb that current crisis or challenge that we currently grappling with, I think for me, we should stay away from offsets, because I feel like we're already sending a wrong message out there if we already entertaining that you could then go through the whole mitigation hierarchy and then come to a point where you feel offsets unnecessary. And when you're saying offset are then necessary in terms, never mind what target 3 states, because target 3 is about, I think, 30% conservation or contributing 30% into conserving terrestrial land, water, etc. And then when you then look at that in relation to wind energy project, the one thing that we've been promoting for wind is that they can coexist with various developments, and a lot can still take place. But then when you then bring in offsetting into that discussion, for me, we're just treading on very dangerous ground. And if you were offsetting, for example, let's say you kill, or there's a collision with 3 vultures, would then offsetting be maybe going to another area or a wetland area and then conserving wetland habitat? But then can you quantify that as a true offset? So for me, I would want us in our planning and thinking ahead in terms of wind energy, we go to those areas that would not necessarily require us to even entertain thoughts of offsetting. So I will just hold it there because I have my own personal views, obviously, about offsetting. They could possibly, from maybe a grassland perspective, contribute to the target. But I think there are additional things at play, because once you have the habitat for species there, then it means that the actual species is also in existence in that specific area, and there's a high risk of collision. And then when you're thinking of offsetting, as Kagiso was saying, what are we offsetting? Because that's one critical question that we would need to answer. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Cindy. No, I think that's very, very clear and really, really important in the context of this. Andrew, you want to add something?
Yeah, thanks, Kish. I just want to add to what, just comment on what Cindy said. And I don't have a lot of information about it, but my understanding is that Kapito Wind Farm in Kenya had requirements for shutdown on demand, and through their IFC lender requirements, they had to essentially implement let's call it an offset, a bird offset, and demonstrate no net loss. And I don't have a lot of information on it, but I understand that it was relatively successful. I don't know how it is now, but they were doing that through, as Cindy mentioned, if they were killing X number of vultures, they had to then demonstrate through conservation outcomes, such as I think it was mostly power line mitigation and probably I think some poisoning prevention and outreach, et cetera, that they were then compensating for that. Yeah, like I said, I don't know if it was successful, but it's something that maybe the department can look into.
Perfect. Thanks, Andrew. Matt, I see you unmuted yourself. Did you want to add anything?
Kish, if you don't mind, I just think there's an important distinction to make between species compensation, mitigation, because I try and steer away from using the O word when we talk about that, and habitat offsetting. And I think Cindy touched on it, because a wind energy facility can coexist with the environment, and even though shutdown and demand systems can be very effective, unfortunately, as I mentioned right at the start, avifaunal fatalities are going to be a reality of wind energy, even if we can get them down to sustainable levels. Recognizing that, the IFC, as Andrew now has also alluded to, allows compensation mitigation to, and here I go using the word, offset specific species fatalities, where you can demonstrate that conservation initiatives can be applied to lead to net gains in species populations, even though you are resulting in some fatalities on your wind energy facility. And I know that habitat-based offsetting is very difficult for wind, because what did you say? What are you offsetting? But when you're trying to mitigate impacts onto a population, I really and truly believe that compensation mitigation has got an extremely important part to play in the South African wind energy avifaunal management discourse. And I think some very exciting things are coming out in the Eastern Cape in this specific regard that I really hope gets some traction.
Fantastic, Matt. And I think it certainly as an outcome of today, we're going to have probably a more dedicated session towards this topic for the sector as well. I'm going to go into some of the questions that have been posted both in the chat and in the Q&A section. And just for the panelists, if we haven't been able to answer all the questions, if you can try and help to answer some of them online where you see fit, it will really help us out in terms of time. Otherwise, if questions are not answered, we'll make sure that the panelists are able to provide a response following this session as well. But I'm going to start off with a question here. I think this is going to be for you, Victor. From Linda Biggs, and it's around, to whom is the developer accountable for implementing the EMPR?
Thanks. A very interesting question. I think basically one has to look at what the intention of the EMPR is. when I'm from a sector that deals with compliance, and that is one of the tools that we look at in terms of what are the things that have been indicated for you to do to be compliant with certain conditions. So we have situations where there are built-in mechanisms. For example, you would have a requirement for an ECO or an external ECO to make sure that whatever is supposed to be done, which is outlined in the EMPR, is undertaken. So for us, we ascertain compliance in terms of what is contained in the EMPR. So I think for us to look at that, you would have to look at from which perspective you're coming from, the context. From a compliance and enforcement, it serves a certain purpose. From the facility side, it serves a certain purpose. From the ECO or the external ECO, that is, if instructed by the conditions to be in place, it will have a different context. But for everyone, it is something that is safeguarding and making sure that there's no degradation of the environment in whatever sector that EMPR is on. So I'm not necessarily pinpointing who owns that document, so to speak, but there is a responsibility that is placed in that document in terms of what is supposed to be undertaken to safeguard conservation and the environment. Thanks.
Thank you, Victor. I've got a question here, and I'm going to pose this through to Matt. It's from Kerry Walter. And the question is, when discussing acceptable mortality thresholds based on US models, how do these translate to the situation in Southern Africa? In the US, raptor populations face far fewer threats, while vultures in South Africa and the region face multiple severe cumulative pressures. Because of this, I'm unsure whether US thresholds can serve as a meaningful baseline for our vultures. For species listed as critically endangered, shouldn't any avoidable loss be considered unacceptable? And Sam, you can also add into this if you would like.
So I think, Sam, my answers are probably going to be very similar, as they often are. So I think that the first answer is that species fatality limits for foreign avifaunal species simply would not be applicable to Southern Africa. It was simply an example to say that these sorts of systems are implemented in other regions of the world. And so we would need to consider our own populations of sensitive species and potential offtake limits, and then to determine our own fatality thresholds. I think with regards to critically endangered species, I think although this would be determined on a case-by-case basis or for a region or for a species, I think for critically endangered avifaunal species, very low to zero avifaunal fatality thresholds should be strived for.
Thanks, Matt. Sam, anything else?
Sorry, I seem to be having trouble with my keyboard. I think Matt said most of what I wanted to say, but maybe just to add, I noticed that in the Q&A, Kerry expressed concern that we're focusing on mitigation and not on avoidance. And I think it's a really valid issue to raise. And because this discussion was framed about mitigation and ensuring how we can make sure that EMPRs are robust and implemented, we haven't spoken enough about the need for spatial avoidance. That's not to say that it's not critical, but I also think we need to be realistic that we see impacts of species in areas where we didn't expect to see vultures, for example, and we're never going to get away from the need for mitigation and at most of our wind farms in South Africa, just by the nature of our diversity. So it's not to say avoidance isn't critical and we shouldn't be striving for no impacts, but the risk of impacts is always going to be there.
Sorry, I just had to mute someone. Okay, there's another question, and I think also posed directly to you, Matt, from Rob Simmons. Just give me
Yes,
one
I
second.
did plagiarize your photograph.
So Rob, my apologies, I've now lost Rob's question. I just got another 24 questions into there, so everyone's adding in. Rob, as soon as I find your question, I'm going to come back. But I've actually found a different one of your questions. I'm going to ask this to the panel. Can the SAWEA representatives here tell us how many wind energy facilities have implemented blade patterning and automated shutdown on demand? And with all the talk of blade patterning in the session today, we need some data from South Africa, please. So I think it's an appeal. I don't know if that information is available. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, Kish, I actually just posted an answer to Rob in the chat. I can't say offhand how many the exact numbers, but I can say that we're busy constructing a wind farm in the Dar area right now. And we'll have 25 turbines, and all 25 of those will be painted. We'll have a blade painted. I can send you some pictures of those blades, Rob. They're currently on their way to site. I know that the neighboring wind farm that has recently been constructed also has some blade painting, although be it a different pattern. And I think this is well, the wind farm that we're busy constructing now will have it will have blade painting. It will also have automated observer-based, sorry, not automated. It will have observer-based shutdown on demand across all 25 turbines. And it will also have automated shutdown on demand on 1/3 or eight of the turbine placements that were deemed to be the most risky. And that's going to be automated. That's actually a predictive model that Jon mentioned earlier, in that there's going to be an AI model that takes data, real-time data from the MetMast on site, and using an AI predictive model based on an extensive amount of GPS tracking data from Eagles will then determine the likelihood of Eagles flying and shut down turbines at certain time. We are looking at the option of potentially doing a camera system instead on those 8 turbines, but that's still in the planning phase. So essentially 3 different layers of mitigation. And I just want to quickly just touch on something that Matt said. And Matthew, we might have to have another discussion around it, because I'm not sure I agree with you 100%. And this is kind of a practical example where you mentioned the race to the bottom, and this is an example of where that hasn't really happened. You've got 2 wind farms in the same environment, likely with the same risks, and as far as I understand, the one will have far more extensive mitigation applied, and that's coming down partly to it being a slightly newer project, but also to it having different specialists and different specialist recommendations.
Kagiso, you wanted to add into there?
Yeah, sorry, that's my mic. Yes, I wanted to add, I mean, I think as Andrew was speaking, I thought of maybe taking down my hand, but we also have quite a cluster where we've painted our blades. It's 2 different sets of clusters, but we're looking at quite a lot of number of turbines, more than 50, and we've decided to paint all of them, and we're also looking at SDOD. But I think what I'm trying to get at is, and I'm sure the same way I didn't know about Andrew's project, Andrew didn't know about my project, but we are all in the same industry. So like I've said, it is a competitive industry. So to share data is one of the hardest things that we struggle with. But I think maybe with guidance from the industry, there should be, I don't know, maybe a platform or some ways where we're able to share the data, because with one of our sites, we are next to a wind farm that isn't painted, and they've been in operations for more than 5 years. So we just gearing up for operations, you know, and it would be great to really do a formal study where we're comparing the data from the two. So in addition to other tools that we're trying to use just to monitor and really understand our species, we are doing a lot, but if another wind farm is not able to share that data, it makes it quite difficult for us to perhaps, you know, publish a study where we're trying to do a good comparison between the two. So yeah, I mean, Sam, I don't know if this is putting you on the spot, but perhaps, or Kish from SAWEA, what ways can you encourage IPPs to share data? Because I mean, we do submit data to you, but at operational level. But how can you share data and really try and maybe, you know, streamline the research that we all trying to come up with in the industry?
Thank you, Kagiso. Sam, do you want to respond to that just briefly, and then I'll move on to 2 more questions.
Yeah, Kagiso, so both pre-construction monitoring data and post-construction monitoring data should be shared with NGOs, including Birdlife South Africa and EWT. I think the question is, you know, is it in a comparable format? We were talking about data standardization earlier. And I would imagine the best bet would be for all the wind farms that are conducting those trials or painting blades to come together and appoint a researcher from an academic institute to conduct a meta-analysis across all sites. I think that would probably be the most effective way. And I do know that there are some academics waiting in the wings, very keen to look at that.
Thank you, Sam. I'm going to go to 2 more questions, then we're going to do some just key takeaways, and then I'm going to give Matt and Santosh an opportunity to take us on the way forward. So there's a question from Megan Bromfield around fatality thresholds for adaptive management and the need to have effective monitoring for the lifespan of the facilities. Monitoring at the moment is only taking place for 2 years in most places. Avifaunal sensitivity can change over a lifespan of facilities, and will the revised EMPR guidelines include extended monitoring? So I'm going to pose this towards Cindy and Sam. I don't know who would like to go first. Maybe you, Sam. I can see your camera on, and we'll give Cindy some time to think about this.
Good. I'm happy to answer that. So, Megan, the current best practice guidelines talk about operational phase monitoring, and they say as a minimum, monitoring should be for 2 years and then repeated year 5, etc., etc. But that's as a minimum, and the way it was framed was quite open-ended, and it was up to the avifaunal specialist to recommend that monitoring continues. And this is where one of the places where things have been falling apart and specialist recommendations aren't always implemented. But certainly it is something that I think in our shutdown on demand handbook, for example, we do say that if shutdown on demand is implemented, it should be combined with monitoring, because how else do you know whether it's effective or not? So it is something that I think we're still consulting what this minimum requirement is going to look like, but it is something I think we'll need to pay attention to.
Thank you, Sam. Cindy, anything to add to that?
I think, sorry about the blanket, it's cold here. My addition is that I think we really need to have a serious conversation about the legal reforms that need to take place to enable all of these things. Because even if Sam comes up with her guideline, and remember the problems that we're facing now are with facilities that are already operational. So we need to find a way of ensuring that there are legal mechanisms in place that enables us as competent authorities to go back and apply the lessons learned to the facilities that are currently in operation, where we are seeing this data coming out from. So for me, from a competent authority perspective, I hear the work that is going in the guideline, but we need to build in the legal reforms in place that allows Victor as a compliance enforcement officer when he receives a monitoring report that shows unacceptable levels of impact, to then be in a position to say, or to say to the holder of the EA, based on this, I recommend that these adaptive management measures need to be included in your current EMPR. Currently, as competent authorities, we do not have that. Only the holder of the EA can amend the EMPR based on actions on outcomes. We need to have something in place that allows competent authorities to respond to the monitoring reports that they are receiving from the holders and from the ECOs. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Cindy. I suppose just the only thing I can add into that conversation is that there are three wind energy facilities in South Africa that, through their environmental authorization, were given conditions to monitor for the lifespan of the project. So as opposed to just the minimum requirements, they actually have to monitor for the lifespan of the project. And I think, you know, we need to find consistency, and that's certainly something that has been raised through this process. I'm going to do one last question, and I'm going to ask it to you, Jon. And this is from Luke, and it's about how do we do independent studies on automated shutdown technologies that will be acceptable to the competent authority and NGOs, whilst also protecting our clients' privacy and IP? It's a very tricky question, Luke.
Thanks, Luke. I think that my first take would be that we need to get some academics and universities involved in this kind of work. I think that it's not necessarily best suited to the consulting sector. So I would suggest maybe making contact with some of the universities. There may be some of the guys on the call now in terms of who can do it. The second part of the question, I don't know. I mean, we have to get out of this. We can't keep saying that we're not learning lessons quickly enough, that things are confidential on projects. At some point, the projects have to take a bigger picture view via SAWEA's leadership, hopefully, and it relates to Kagiso's point as well. The industry has to start working together more at that level. So someone has to break the ice with using these technology products, and then as soon as possible, get results out to all of us. Otherwise, the whole industry is stalled by the lack of confidence in mitigation. So someone has to take that bigger picture view. I think there are developers that will do that. So maybe you, Luke, need to make contact with those particular developers and universities and try and set up that type of study.
Excellent. Thank you, Jon. So at this point, what I am going to do is thank our panel. Really appreciate your time today. It's been a very interesting conversation, but it's also the beginning of trying to address some aspects on the mitigation hierarchy, particularly around minimization. And I think, you know, there are quite a few comments and questions posed around the avoidance concept on the mitigation hierarchy. And I'm just going to make sure that you know, we comment forward to SAWEA to think about, you know, thinking a little bit more about avoidance in some of the workshop discussions, because I think largely this was pitched at minimization, or when the authorization is given, you know, how do we minimize and keep it fair? But I do think the avoidance concept is also still something that we need to get our heads around. I'm going to be very brief, and then I'm going to hand over to Matt and then Santosh. I think 5 key takeaways for me. Consistency is essential in this space, and I don't need to go into detail for that. Evidence must drive decisions, particularly in the South African context. So we need to build evidence up in our own space in order to enable these standards to make sense. Standardization will likely unlock fairness and efficiency, and I think that's going to be a crucial component. Outcomes-based thresholds, as Matt has indicated, are a promising next step, but you know, there's more discussion to be had, and I think that's going to be the purpose of the roadshow, is to see what can be done and what is realistic in terms of us being able to execute that in South Africa. And then collaboration is critical for progress. So collaboration across all the different role players and stakeholders in the sector is going to be really important for us to ensure that this wind energy sector is done in a way that outlines responsible development. And I think that's the most important aspect of this way forward. Matt, I'm going to hand over to you to just give us a little bit more idea of the way forward, and then Santosh, if you can just close this session. Thank you, colleagues, for your time.
Thank you, Kish, and I'll let Santosh thank you formally. But just very briefly, as mentioned earlier, South African Wind Energy Association is collaborating with other members of the avifaunal industry to develop minimum requirements for avifaunal mitigation at wind energy facilities. And obviously an important stakeholder there is Birdlife South Africa. I hope to see EWT becoming more and more involved, and I suspect that might be the case after Kish's involvement today. But another person that I want to just identify as part of that sort of working group is Barry Wiesner from Mthembu, who brings a lot of on-site experience, which is invaluable to this working group. So it really is very special. But what we're looking to do is we want to develop minimum requirements for avifaunal mitigation in South Africa, non-prescriptive. And in order to do so, we want to engage a wide variety of stakeholders within the industry, including lenders, government, NGOs, IPPs, developers. I'm sure I've left some out, but as far and wide as possible, to develop these guidelines. And to do this, we're having a series of 3 workshops in Cape Town on the 26th of November, in Quebec on the 27th of November, and Johannesburg on the 28th of November. And at these workshops, we intend to critically evaluate real-world environmental management systems for operational wind farms in South Africa, or wind farms in South Africa, not necessarily operational, in order to identify common shortcomings and gaps in avifaunal mitigation and management, and then also obviously to gather input from stakeholders in the industry regarding what industry guidance on minimum requirements should and should not look like. And the ultimate purpose is to level the playing field, which aligns squarely with South African Wind Energy Association's declaration on the promotion of competitive behavior by role players. And therefore, I really look forward to continuing this engagement with various different stakeholders in the industry while we develop this very important material. And before I hand over to Santosh to thank everybody, I just want to have my own personal thank you to somebody that isn't on the panel today. That's Caroline Beer, who's the MD of CES and our SAWEA Birds and Wind Energy Task Team lead. Caroline's dedication and professionalism and persistence has really been instrumental in driving this initiative. And I'd really like to offer her my personal heartfelt thanks for all the efforts that she's put into this initiative. So thank you very much, Caroline. Over to you, Santosh.
Thank you, Matthew. So to close that out, I think I would like to thank all the panelists from today's session, to Kish, to Matthew, to everyone else on our panels. To the attendees, thank you for joining. I think the attendance rate for today indicates how much the session was needed, and the amount of conversations happening in the Q&A as well as the chat function shows how many more sessions may be needed to take this topic to its fruition. So thank you to all our partners, to Birdlife South Africa, to EWT, to SLR, to the Eastern Cape, to DIAT, and SP Wind, who will be hosting the upcoming roadshows that I'll speak about shortly. I think today's session has highlighted the importance of developing projects responsibly. We need to get the balance right between developing energy projects and ensuring that we sustain biodiversity in South Africa, because it is a critical resource for us. I think especially going into the just energy transition, the topics we talked about today, establishing these thresholds and establishing standardized methods on the way forward is going to be critical as we see a flooding of projects come online and be developed. And we need public and social partner support for that to happen. Kish has very effectively summarized the key takeaways for today. From us, just to link it back to Indaba, I think critically is data sharing, ensuring publicly available information, and a call to action, both for industry members and for the association, to perhaps look at how to aggregate the blade patterning data and its effectiveness as one of the mitigation strategies going forward. We recognize some of the concerns today regarding offsets versus compensation, thresholds versus avoidance. And I think what we need as an industry, as a sector going forward, is agreement on the definitions and the intent of what we want to achieve going forward. With that, we will continue the conversations at the roadshow from the 26th to the 28th of November. We have pasted the information in the chat. As a roundup, we will be circulating the recording of this webinar by email to all attendees. It will also be available on our YouTube channel. Thank you all for attending and have a great day and weekend.
Thank you, Santosh. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.